My sister demanded a cut of my new company. She sat across from me at my kitchen table with her arms folded and said family shares everything equally, and she expected me to agree and hand over half of what I had spent 4 years building from nothing. So I agreed. I pulled out the paperwork right there at the table: partnership agreement, standard language, clean format, 2 signature lines at the bottom. She grabbed the pen before I finished explaining the document. She signed on the second line and slid it back across the table with the satisfied look of someone who had just gotten exactly what they came for. She had, just not what she thought she had. What my sister signed that evening was a 50% equity stake in a company that carried $3 million in active business debt, equipment financing, commercial lease obligations, vendor credit lines, payroll commitments, $3 million of liability that now had her name attached to it in the same proportion as her claimed ownership. She found out 4 days later when her bank called. The bank had a lien protocol attached to new partnership agreements above a certain liability threshold. Standard procedure. The call was routine from the bank's perspective. From my sister's perspective, it was the beginning of a conversation she had never expected to have. She called me immediately after the bank call. Her voice was a completely different thing from the voice that had said family shares everything equally across my kitchen table 4 days before. Before I tell you what she said and what I said back and what the next 6 months looked like for both of us, I need to take you to where this story actually starts. Because my sister did not decide overnight that she was entitled to half of what I built. That conclusion came from a long time of watching, and from a specific misunderstanding about what watching something get built meant relative to being the person who built it. And I need to tell you about the building, every part of it. From the first year when I was operating out of a rented storage unit with a second-hand computer and a phone I could barely afford the plan for, to the moment 4 years later when the company was real enough that my sister decided she deserved half of it. Because the building is the story. Everything else is just the math at the end. Like this video right now. Subscribe to this channel, ring the notification bell, and drop a comment below. Let us get into it. My name is Laura Simmons, and I am 44 years old. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a house on Fernwood Drive that was a good house in the specific sense of being solid and clean, and full of people who loved each other even when they were driving each other completely insane, which in my family was a regular occurrence. My father, Dennis Simmons, ran a small HVAC service company for 23 years. He had started it with 1 van and a certification, and the understanding that Louisiana summers were guaranteed income for anyone willing to show up when people's air conditioning stopped working in August. He built it slowly and carefully, and kept it small enough that he knew every customer by name and never had more work than he could personally oversee. He was not rich, he was stable. He knew the difference, and he chose stable every time because stable meant his kids had what they needed without his heart rate going up every time the phone did not ring. My mother, Patricia, was a school librarian. She had the specific quality of someone whose professional environment rewarded patience and precision, and who brought both of those things home every evening in a way that made our house feel organized even when it was not. She was the person you went to with problems because she did not react to the problem first. She understood it first, then she responded. I have spent my adult life trying to be more like my mother in that specific way. I have not always succeeded. There were 3 of us. My older brother Kevin was 4 years ahead of me. He went into nursing and lives in Shreveport now, and has always been the uncomplicated one, the one who figured out what he wanted early and went and got it without a great deal of drama along the way. My younger sister Diane was 2 years behind me. And here is where I need to stop and be honest about Diane, because this story requires honesty about her, an honesty about the dynamic between us, an honesty about the role I played in creating the situation that eventually produced the kitchen table scene. Diane was the youngest, and she had the specific quality of the youngest in a family where the older siblings had done most of the groundbreaking. The path had been cleared before she arrived. The expectations were calibrated. The family understood its rhythms, and she slid into those rhythms in a way that required less friction than Kevin and I had required getting there. She was charming and social, and she made friends easily, and she moved through the world with a lightness that I genuinely admired, and that I sometimes, in my less generous moments, envied. She had never run anything. She had never started anything. She had worked jobs, good jobs in some cases, a marketing coordinator role at an events company in New Orleans for several years, a retail management position after that. She was capable and she worked hard when she was interested in the work. But she had never looked at a blank space and decided to fill it with something that had never existed before. That specific experience was mine. And the distance between having that experience and observing it from the outside turned out to be the exact distance between what Diane believed she was entitled to and what she actually had any claim to. Let me tell you about the blank space. I spent my 20s in logistics, freight brokerage specifically. I worked for a regional firm in Baton Rouge for 7 years, moving cargo between manufacturers and distributors across the Gulf Coast and into the Southeast. I was good at it, genuinely good. The work required a combination of relationship management and operational precision that turned out to match the exact shape of how my brain worked, and I built a reputation in that firm as someone whose loads moved and whose clients came back. In my 7th year, I watched the firm lose 2 of its largest accounts to a competitor that offered better technology. Not better service, better technology. A platform that gave shippers real-time visibility into their cargo in a way that our firm, operating on systems that had been built in the mid-90s, simply could not match. I watched those accounts leave. I sat in the conference room after the second account departure, and I thought about what had just happened. The relationship was ours. The operational quality was ours. The institutional knowledge of those clients' specific needs was ours, and we lost them because someone else had built a better window for the client to look through. I spent the next 6 months thinking about that window. Not at work, after work, at home, on weekends, in the specific obsessive way that an idea occupied a certain kind of mind once it had planted itself. I understood freight brokerage from the inside. I understood what shippers actually needed to see and when they needed to see it. I understood what information made the difference between a client who trusted you and a client who was always slightly anxious about where their cargo was and what was happening to it. I understood the problem, and I had a very specific idea about the solution. At 30 years old, I left the firm. I gave 3 months' notice, which was longer than required, because I respected the people there, and because I did not want to leave in a way that burned anything down. My boss said, "Are you sure about this?" I said, "I have been sure for 6 months. I just needed the plan to be ready." He said, "What is the plan?" I said, "A technology platform for freight visibility, built specifically for small and mid-sized shippers who get priced out of the enterprise solutions." He said, "That market is crowded." I said, "The enterprise side is crowded. The small and mid-sized side has a lot of legacy tools that nobody has invested in properly because the individual contract values are smaller. But the volume of small and mid-sized shippers is enormous, and the aggregate opportunity is real." He said, "You have done the math." I said, "I have done the math 3 times. He shook my hand. He said, "Come back if it does not work." I said, "I will call you when it does." I had $14,000 in savings. I rented a storage unit on Airline Highway for $220 a month because it had power outlets and climate control and a door I could lock. And I set up a second-hand desk and a computer and a whiteboard, and I started building. The company was called Clearline Logistics Technology. The name came from the idea of a clear line of sight between a shipper and their cargo. No mystery, no phone calls to find out where something was, just visibility all the time in a format that made sense to someone who was running a business and did not have time to interpret a complex dashboard. That was the idea. That was the empty space I was filling. And for the first 2 years, filling it was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. The first year was the year I understood what the word hard actually meant when applied to building something from nothing. Before I started, I had understood hard in the way that people understood things they had observed but not yet experienced. I had watched my father manage the cash flow anxiety of a small business for 23 years. I had seen what it looked like from the outside. I thought I understood it. I understood it the way you understood water before you had ever been underwater. The actual experience was different. Month 3, I had burned through 9,000 of the 14,000 in savings and had 0 paying customers and a prototype that was functional, but that needed significant work before it was ready to show to serious prospects. I sat in the storage unit on a Tuesday evening in November with the Baton Rouge heat finally breaking outside, and I did the math on what I had left and how long it would last, and I felt the specific fear that came from understanding that the gap between what you had and what you needed was larger than the time available to close it through normal effort. I called my father. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Laura." I said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." He said, "Ask." I said, "I need a loan, not a gift. A loan with interest at whatever rate you think is fair. I need $20,000 to get through the next 6 months while I close the first contracts." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How close are you?" I said, "I have 2 serious conversations with potential clients. One of them is going to convert. The prototype is good enough to show now. I need time to let the conversation happen." He said, "And if the conversation does not convert?" I said, "Then I will have given everything I had, and I will figure out the next step from there." He said, "Okay." He said, 20,000, 5% interest, repayment when the company is generating consistent revenue, put it in writing. I said, "I will have the document to you by Friday." He said, "Laura." I said, "Yes." He said, "Your grandfather started a business twice before the third one worked. The first 2 ended. He learned something from each one. The learning was not wasted." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I am telling you this so that when you feel like the fear means it is wrong, you remember that the fear is just the feeling of standing on the edge of something real. It means you are in the right place." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Friday, the document." I had the document to him on Thursday. The first client signed 6 weeks later. A mid-sized food distributor in Metairie with 14 active freight lanes and a persistent problem with cargo visibility that their current broker could not solve. I solved it. The contract was small, $4,000 a month, but it was real and it was proof, and the proof was the thing I needed more than anything else at that moment. I called my father. He said, "First one." I said, "First one." He said, "What is the second?" I said, "I already have a meeting next Thursday." He said, "Good, call me after." Subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell, because the growth of Clearline over the next 3 years is the part of this story that Diane watched from the outside. And watching it from the outside was exactly what convinced her she was entitled to half of it. Section 2 is where everything builds and where Diane starts making calculations. The second client came from the meeting on Thursday. The third came from a referral from the second. The fourth from a referral from the first. That was the specific quality of the small and mid-sized shipper market that I had identified in my research. The people in it talked to each other. They attended the same regional trade associations. They used the same brokers. They complained about the same problems to the same peers. And when one of them found something that solved a problem they had all been living with, they told the people they knew. Clearline grew through referral for the first 2 years. Not because I had a sophisticated referral program, because the product solved a real problem, and the people who experienced the solution wanted their colleagues to experience it too. By the end of year 2, I had 22 clients, monthly recurring revenue of just over $90,000, and a team of 4, 2 software developers, a client success manager named Priya who had come from a logistics background and who understood our client's world from the inside, and an operations coordinator named Marcus who handled the day-to-day management of client onboarding and support. I had also, by the end of year 2, taken on debt. This is the part of the story that Diane did not see clearly because it was not visible from the outside. The growth required investment. The investment required capital. The capital, because I had not yet reached the size that traditional equity investors were interested in at meaningful terms, came from debt. Equipment financing for the server infrastructure. A commercial lease for an actual office space in Metairie when the storage unit became genuinely inadequate. A vendor credit line to manage the gap between when I paid the developers and when the clients paid their monthly invoices. A small business credit facility from a community bank in Jefferson Parish that I had spent 3 months building a relationship with. Each of these was a real obligation with a real monthly payment and a real consequence if the payment stopped. By the end of year 2, the total outstanding debt was $1,200,000. By the end of year 3, as the company grew and the investment in growth continued, it was $2,400,000. By the time Diane sat across from me at the kitchen table and said family shares everything equally, the total active liability on Clearline's books was $3,100,000. The company was profitable. The revenue was real. The growth trajectory was clear. Every reasonable financial analysis said the business was healthy and the debt was serviceable and the value was building. But $3 million of obligation was $3 million of obligation, and it was attached to the company the same way the revenue was attached to it. Diane had heard about the revenue. She had heard about the new office, about the team, about the client count and the growth rate and the regional industry recognition that Clearline had started receiving from trade publications. She had not heard about the debt. Not because I was hiding it from her, because she had never asked a specific question about the financial structure of the business. She had asked general questions and received general answers and formed a general picture that was missing the specific detail that changed everything about the picture. The specific detail was $3 million. And when she sat across from me and demanded her share of what she had been watching grow for 4 years, she was demanding her share of a number she had never examined closely enough to understand. I understood this in the first 30 seconds of the conversation. And I made a decision in those 30 seconds that I want to be completely honest about. I decided to let her see the whole picture. Not to trick her, to show her. Because the kindest thing I could do for my sister in that moment was let her understand what she was actually asking for. The conversation started the way a certain kind of family conversation always started, which was at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with good intentions and a gap in information on at least one side. Diane had driven up from New Orleans for the weekend. She had done this increasingly often over the previous year, which I had welcomed because we had always been close, and the geographic distance of the 2-hour drive was one of the reasons we had drifted into the kind of sister relationship that was warm but not deep. She had been present for enough of Clearline's growth, in a peripheral way, to have formed an understanding of what the company was. She had come to the office twice. She had been at a company event the previous spring. She had heard conversations at family dinners and formed conclusions from the pieces. The conclusion she had formed was that I was running a successful and growing software company. This was correct. The conclusion she had not formed, because she had never looked at the financial statements, was the full picture of what running a successful growing software company actually required. She said, "Laura, I have been thinking about something and I want to be direct with you." I said, "Okay." She said, "Clearline is doing well, really well. You have built something significant and I am proud of you. And I have been thinking that as your family, as your sister, I should be part of it in a real way." I said, "What kind of real way?" She said, "A partnership, a real stake. I want to be involved in the business at the ownership level." I said, "What makes you feel entitled to an ownership stake?" She said, "Family shares everything equally. We grew up in the same house. We had the same parents. We had the same opportunities. You built something and I want to share in it." I looked at her. I said, "You want 50%. She said, "Yes, equal partnership. That is what family means." I said, "And what would you contribute to the partnership?" She said, "I am your sister. That is the contribution." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Let me show you the paperwork." She sat up straighter. She looked pleased. She had come in expecting a fight and was getting agreement, which felt like a victory of the fastest and most complete kind. I went to the office and came back with a partnership agreement that my attorney had drafted 18 months earlier as a template for a potential partnership that had not materialized. I had updated it with current numbers the previous week for a different purpose, but the structure was exactly right for what I was about to show Diane. I placed it on the table. I said, "This is a standard partnership agreement. It gives the second partner 50% equity in Clearline Logistics Technology in exchange for the assumption of 50% of the company's existing liabilities and obligations." She said, "What liabilities?" I said, "Read Section 4, subsection B." She was already reaching for the pen. I said, "Diane, read Section 4 first." She looked at me. She looked at the document. She turned to Section 4. She read. She stopped at a number. She said, $3 million. I said, $3,100,000 and change as of the most recent balance sheet. Equipment financing, commercial lease obligations, vendor credit lines, and the bank facility we used to fund the infrastructure build-out. She said, "The company has $3 million in debt." I said, "The company has $3 million in active financing obligations that are entirely serviceable given the current revenue and growth trajectory. The business is healthy. The debt is not distressed debt. It is growth debt. Every dollar of it was used to build what you are looking at." She said, "But it is $3 million. I said, "Yes." She said, "So if I sign this?" I said, "You become a 50% owner of a company with $4 million in annual recurring revenue and a growth rate of 30% year over year, and a team of 9 people, and a client base of 61 companies across the Gulf Coast and Southeast." I paused. I said, "And you become personally liable for 50% of the $3 million in financing obligations, which at the current balance means $1.55 million of debt carries your name." She looked at the document. She looked at me. She said, "Why would you agree to this?" I said, "Because you said family shares everything equally. The revenue is part of the company. The debt is part of the company. If you want equal ownership, you get all of it. That is what equal means." She was quiet. I said, "Do you want to read the rest of the document before you decide?" She reached for the pen. I watched her sign. I said, Diane. She said, we are family. If you agreed to this, it must be fair. She signed on the second line. She slid the document back. She looked up with the expression of someone who had just closed a deal. I did not say anything for a moment. I said, the bank will contact you within the week. Standard procedure when a new partner joins above a certain liability threshold. She said, about what? I said, about the lien protocol. Your name is now on the financing instruments. The bank will want to verify your personal financial information as part of their standard compliance process. She said, my personal financial information. I said, yes. When you accepted the liability, your personal financial position became relevant to the bank's risk assessment. She said, I did not think about that part. I said, you signed the document, Diane. She looked at the paper in front of her. She looked at me. The pleased expression was gone. In its place was something slower and more complicated. She said, I should have read it more carefully. I said, yes, you should have. The bank called her 4 days later. It was a Thursday morning. I was at the office in Metairie doing a review call with our largest client when my phone lit up with Diane's name. I let it go to voicemail. The call ended. I called her back. She answered before the first ring completed. She said, Laura. I said, hey. She said, the bank called. I said, I know. She said they want personal financial documentation, tax returns, bank statements, asset declarations. I said, that is the standard process. She said, they said they are going to run a personal credit check. I said, yes, because you are now a guarantor on the financing instruments. She said, a guarantor. I said, 50% guarantor, which at the current debt level means $1.55 million in personal liability exposure. She was quiet. She said, Laura, I need to talk to you about this. I said, I'm happy to talk. Come up this weekend. She said, can we talk now? I said, Diane, this is a significant financial and legal situation. It deserves a proper conversation in person. Come up Saturday. I will make dinner. She drove up Saturday. She was at my door at noon. She came in and sat at the same kitchen table, and she looked different from the Sunday 3 weeks before. The lightness she usually carried had a weight on top of it. The specific weight of someone who had signed something they had underestimated and who had been living with that understanding for 3 weeks. I made coffee. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table. She said, I need you to help me get out of this. I said, tell me what you mean. She said, the document, the partnership, I need it reversed. I need my name off the debt. I said, why? She said, because I cannot carry $1.5 million of liability. Laura, my total personal assets are my car and about $14,000 in savings. If this company had a problem, I would lose everything. I said, yes, that is correct. She said, so help me get out. I looked at her. I said, Diane, I want to ask you something and I need you to hear it as a real question and not as an attack. She said, okay. I said, when you sat at this table 3 weeks ago and said family shares everything equally, what did you think you were asking for? She said, I thought. She stopped. She said, I thought I was asking for a share of the revenue. I said, just the revenue. She said, yes. I said, you wanted the income without the investment that produced it. She said, I did not know about the debt. I said, you did not ask about the debt. She said, you should have told me. And here is the moment where I had to be completely honest with myself and with her. I said, you are right that I could have told you, and I want to be fair about that. But I also want to be honest. I tried to get you to read the document. You reached for the pen before I finished explaining it. You signed it because you assumed I had agreed to something that was in your favor and you wanted to capture it before I changed my mind. She said, that is not. I said, Diane, you signed a legal document without reading it, and now you want the consequences reversed because the document said something you did not expect. I understand why you want that, but I need you to understand what actually happened here. She was quiet. I said, you came here and told me that family shares everything equally, and you used that as a justification for demanding half of something I built alone over 4 years with my own money and my own debt and my own team. You did not offer to work here. You did not offer capital. You offered the fact that we share the same parents. She looked at the table. I said I agreed to show you what equal actually looked like. And what equal looked like was the whole picture. The revenue and the debt, the growth and the obligation, the success and the risk. She said, you trapped me. I said I showed you the document. I told you to read section 4. I said it out loud. You signed before finishing. She said, I trusted you. I said, I know, and I want to help you, but I need you to understand the full picture first. Because the conversation we need to have going forward requires you to see clearly what you actually asked for and what it means. She said, what conversation? I said, the conversation about what the partnership actually looks like if it continues. She said, what? I said, Diane, you are a 50% partner in Clearline. The document is signed and witnessed. If you want out, there is a process for that and I am willing to support it. But I want to talk about the alternative first. She said, the alternative. I said, yes, because you told me you wanted to be involved in the business, and I think there might be a version of that which is real and which makes sense. Just not the version where you walk in and claim half of something without contributing anything to it. She looked at me. She said, what kind of real? I said, tell me something. What do you actually know how to do? She said, what? I said, professionally, what are you genuinely skilled at? She thought. She said, events. Logistics for events. I have been doing that for 12 years. I know how to coordinate moving things and people and timelines simultaneously. I know how to manage vendor relationships. I know how to stay calm when something goes wrong in the middle of a complicated operation. I said, those are real skills. She said, yes. I said, they are also skills that apply to something Clearline needs. She said, what? I said, client implementation. When a new client comes on board, the onboarding process is currently handled by Priya and Marcus, and it is the area where we lose the most time. A dedicated implementation coordinator with your background in event logistics could cut our average onboarding time by 40%. I have been looking for the right person for that role for 4 months. She said, you want to hire me? I said, I want to offer you a real role with a real salary and a real equity stake that is commensurate with what you actually contribute. 3% to start. Performance-based growth from there. The liability does not attach to you personally in the same way because the structure would be an employment equity grant rather than a general partnership. She said, and the current document? I said, the current document gets dissolved. My attorney has already drafted the unwind agreement. I was going to bring it out at the end of this conversation if you were willing to talk seriously about what a real version looked like. She said, you had the unwind agreement ready. I said, yes. She said, before I drove up here. I said, yes. She said, so you were never going to let me stay in the partnership the way it was signed. I said, no, because the partnership as signed was not good for you. 1.55 million in personal liability exposure on someone with 14,000 in savings is a bad deal for you. I knew that when you signed it. She said, then why did you let me sign it? I said, because you needed to see the whole picture. You came here claiming a right to half of something based on the logic of family sharing everything equally. I needed you to actually see what sharing everything equally meant before we could have a real conversation. She said that was not kind. I said no, it was not gentle, but it was honest, and I think honest is more useful to you right now than gentle. She sat with that for a long time. She said, "You thought about this before I came over." I said, "I thought about it the moment you said family shares everything equally 3 weeks ago. I knew then what the conversation actually needed to be. I just needed you to be ready to have it." She said, "So what you did, showing me the document, that was part of making me ready." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is manipulative." I said, "I told you to read section 4. You chose to sign without reading it. The only thing I did was agree to something you asked for and show you what you were asking for." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "Laura." I said, "Yes." She said, "The job, tell me more about it." Subscribe to this channel right now. Ring the bell, because what happened between me and Diane over the next 6 months is the thing I did not expect, and it changed both of us in ways I want to tell you about directly. Section 4 is where the real story begins. Diane took the job. She took it after 4 hours of conversation at that kitchen table that covered, in full, the actual financial structure of Clearline, the specifics of the implementation coordinator role, the equity grant structure, the salary, and the conditions for performance-based growth. She asked real questions. For the first time in the entire history of our conversations about my company, she asked questions that went below the surface of the visible success and into the actual mechanics of how it worked. I answered every one. At the end of the 4 hours, she said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "You do not have to do that right now." She said, "Yes, I do. Right now, before anything else. I came here 3 weeks ago and made a claim on something I had contributed nothing to, and I justified it with a phrase that was not an argument. It was just an entitlement wrapped in family language. And I signed a document without reading it because I assumed you had agreed to something that benefited me, and I wanted to capture it before you reconsidered." She said, "That was not the behavior of a partner. That was the behavior of someone who wanted the result of hard work without the hard work." I said, "Diane." She said, "Let me finish." I let her finish. She said, "I have watched you build this for 4 years. I came to the office. I was at the event. I heard the conversations at family dinners. And somewhere in all of that watching, I convinced myself that proximity to the building was the same as participating in the building." She said, "It is not." I said, "No, it is not." She said, "So I want to participate, for real, if the offer is still there." I said, "The offer is there." She said, "I need the unwind agreement first." I said, "I have it right here." I got it from the folder on the counter. She read the entire thing before she touched the pen. Every page. When she looked up, she said, "You included a penalty clause." I said, "Yes." She said, "If I leave before 12 months, a portion of the equity grant returns." I said, "Standard vesting structure. 12 months cliff, then monthly vesting over the following 24. If you leave in month 1, you keep nothing. If you leave in month 24, you keep most of it." She said, "That is fair." I said, "It is designed to align your incentives with the company's timeline. You contribute, you stay, you share in the growth. You leave early, the benefit is proportionally reduced." She said, "I understand." She signed the unwind agreement. She signed the employment agreement. She signed the equity grant documentation. She read every word of all 3 before signing any of them. I noticed this. I said nothing about it. She started at Clearline the following Monday. The first 3 months were an education for both of us. For Diane, the education was the specific experience of understanding a company from the inside rather than the outside. The actual texture of the work, the weight of client calls that did not go well, the pressure of an onboarding that ran into technical complications and needed to be resolved without the client losing confidence, the specific daily reality of being accountable to outcomes rather than to impressions. She worked harder than I had expected, not in the performative way of someone trying to prove a point in the early days of a new role, in the sustained way of someone who had found something that matched the shape of their actual skills. Her event logistics background was exactly what the implementation coordinator role needed. She understood how to manage multiple timelines simultaneously. She understood vendor relationships in a way that translated directly to our integration partners. She understood how to stay calm in front of a client when something was going wrong, which was the single most important quality in that role because things went wrong regularly, and the client's experience of how Clearline handled it was more important to long-term retention than whether the thing had gone wrong at all. Priya pulled me aside in month 2. She said, "Diane is going to be really good at this." I said, "I know." She said, "Was that the plan all along?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "Bringing her in this way." I said, "The plan all along was to give her the honest picture and see what she did with it. What she did with it was her own." Priya looked at me. She said, "You are a strange kind of generous." I said, "How do you mean?" She said, "You set up a situation that looked like a trap but was actually an education. And then you had the job waiting." I said, "The job was real. I have been looking for the right person for that role for 4 months." She said, "And Diane was the right person." I said, "Diane has the right skills. Whether she is the right person for the job is what the next 12 months will tell us." She was the right person. Her onboarding numbers by month 6 were better than anything Priya and Marcus had produced in the same role. Average onboarding time was down 38% from the previous 6-month average. Client satisfaction scores at the 30-day mark were the highest we had measured since we started tracking them. She had found something she was genuinely good at, and she was building something real for the first time in her professional life. I watched this happen from across the office, and I felt something that was more complex than pride. It was something closer to relief. Relief that the version of Diane who had sat at the kitchen table and demanded what she had not built was not the only version of my sister that existed. That the other version, the one who was capable and driven when the work was real and the stakes were real, was also there and was also her. The conversation that changed the shape of things between us permanently happened on a Tuesday evening in month 4. We had stayed late working through a complicated onboarding situation with a client in Pensacola who had discovered mid-implementation that their existing system had data formatting issues that our platform was not reading correctly. It was a solvable problem, but it required several hours of coordination between Diane and the developer team and the client's internal IT staff simultaneously. Diane handled the entire thing. She was on 3 calls simultaneously for a 40-minute stretch, moving between them with the specific focused calm of someone who had managed complicated logistics for 12 years and who had found the register. At 9:15 p.m., the client confirmed that the data issue was resolved and the implementation was back on track. Diane put down her headset and looked at her screen for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "That was a hard one." I said, "Yes, it was." She said, "But we kept them." I said, "We kept them." She said, "Because of what you built, the platform could handle the data format issue. A lot of platforms could not." I said, "I know." She said, "Laura." I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Were you angry at me when I came to the table and said what I said?" I thought about this honestly. I said, "I was clear. I am not sure angry is the right word. I was clear about what the conversation was actually about, which was that you had formed a conclusion about what you were owed based on watching something from the outside without understanding what it actually cost. She said, I understand it now. I said, I know you do. She said, the debt. I said, yes. She said, I think about the debt differently now than I did before. I said, how? She said, before, when you told me about it at the table, it felt like a threat, like you were showing me something frightening to scare me away from the ownership. I said, and now? She said, now I am here every day and I see what the debt built. The team, the platform, the clients, the office, all of it. The debt is just the cost of what exists, and what exists is real. I said, yes, that is exactly right. She said, I should have asked about all of it before I came in demanding half. I said, yes. She said, I am sorry, Laura, genuinely, for the way I came in and the language I used and the assumption I made. I said, I know. I said, Diane, you signed the document without reading it and then you read everything else before you signed it. That was the change I needed to see. The apology matters, but the change is what actually matters. She said, I changed because you showed me something real. I said, you showed yourself. I just put the whole picture in front of you. She looked at me. She said, that is the kindest mean thing anyone has ever done for me. I laughed. She laughed. It was the first real laugh between us since before the kitchen table. Diane passed her 12-month cliff in October. The equity vesting began. She was good enough at the job that I brought her situation to the board for a discussion about her equity path. And the board, which consisted of myself and 2 outside advisors, agreed that a faster vesting schedule was warranted given her impact on the implementation metrics. The adjusted equity path gave her a path to 6% ownership over 36 months. She did not know about the adjustment until the month after the board conversation, when I gave her the amended grant documentation. She read every page before saying a single word. Then she looked up. She said 6%. I said, if the trajectory continues, yes. She said, that is more than the 3 we talked about. I said, you earned more than we talked about. The implementation numbers justify it. She said, the board agreed to this. I said, the board agreed to this. She said, Laura. I said, yes. She said, I want to say something. I said, say it. She said, 6% of something real that I helped build is better than 50% of something I had nothing to do with. I said, yes. She said, I understand that now in a way I did not understand it in October. I said, I know you do. She said, the version of me that sat at the table and said family shares everything equally. She was talking about a fantasy, a number she had seen from the outside. She was not talking about what was actually in the building. I said, no, she was not. She said, and what is actually in the building is better. I said, I think so. She said, because it is real. I said, yes. My father called me in December of that year. He had been following the situation through our conversations over the months. He knew the full arc, the kitchen table, the document, the job offer, the months of work, the equity conversation. He called on a Wednesday evening when I was driving home from the office. He said, I want to ask you something. I said, ask. He said, when Diane signed that document without reading it, what was going through your mind? I said, relief. He said, relief. I said, yes, because she signed it without reading it, which meant she was still operating from the assumption that ownership was a right rather than a result, and that assumption needed to be made visible before anything real could happen between us in a professional context. The signature made it visible. He said, and the unwind agreement was already drafted. I said, yes. He said, and the job offer was already in your head. I said, yes. He said, Laura. I said, yes, Dad. He said, you handled that the way your grandfather would have handled it. I said, what do you mean? He said, he always said the kindest thing you could do for someone you cared about was give them the honest picture, even when the honest picture was uncomfortable, especially then. He said, you gave Diane the honest picture, and you had the door open on the other side of it. I said, the door was only useful because she was willing to walk through it. He said, yes, but you built the door. We were quiet for a moment. He said, how is she doing, really? I said, really. She is the best implementation coordinator I have ever had, and I have only had 2, so that is not a huge sample size, but she is genuinely good at the work. He said, she found something. I said, she found something. He said, that matters more than the equity. I said, I know. He said, your grandfather would say the same thing. I said, I know he would. He said, the loan, you have repaid it. I said, with interest. He said, 5% was fair. I said, it was very fair. He said, I am proud of you, Laura, of both of you actually. I said, I will tell her you said so. He said, tell her in person, come down for Christmas. I said, we will be there. There is a conversation I have had with 2 different people since the Diane situation that I want to tell you about, because both conversations said something true about what the whole experience meant. The first was with Priya, about 3 months after Diane started. Priya had been watching Diane work for those 3 months, and she came to me on a Friday afternoon and said, can I ask you something about how Diane came to work here? I said, yes. She said, did you set it up, the document situation? I said, I agreed to what she asked for and showed her what she was asking for. She said, but you knew she would sign without reading it. I said, I suspected. I also told her to read section 4. She said, but you had the unwind agreement ready before she drove up. I said, yes. She said, so you knew you were going to offer her the job. I said, I knew I was going to offer her the option. Whether she took it was hers. Priya looked at me. She said, I think what you did was harder than it looked. I said, how do you mean? She said, watching your sister sign a document that exposed her to $1.5 million in liability must have been difficult, even if you knew you were going to resolve it. I said it was not easy. She said, why did you do it that way instead of just saying at the beginning, here is the full picture, here is the debt, here is what you are actually asking for? I said, because if I had said that at the beginning, what she heard would have been a defense. She would have heard me explaining why her claim was wrong, and she would have left the table still believing the claim was right, just blocked by a defense. I said, the document let her experience the claim in full, including the parts she had not considered. That is different from being told. Priya said, you let her feel the weight of the ask. I said, yes. She said, and then you caught her. I said, and then I offered her a door. The second conversation was with Diane herself, about 8 months after she started. We were driving back from a client visit in Covington, and we had the specific kind of conversation that happened in cars on long drives, where the combination of forward motion and the absence of eye contact made it easier to say real things. She said, do you trust me now? I said, yes. She said, more than before October. I said, much more. She said, because I proved something with the work. I said, because you read every document before you signed it. The work proved you were good at the job. Reading the documents proved you understood what you were agreeing to. Those are 2 different things and both of them matter. She said, I think about the first document a lot. I said, the partnership agreement. She said, yes. I think about who I was in that moment, reaching for the pen before you finished explaining it. I said, You were someone who had been watching something grow from the outside for 4 years and had convinced yourself that watching it was the same as building it. She said, and it is not. I said, no, but you know that now in a way that you could not have been told. She said, you had to show me. I said, yes. She said, that is the only way some things get learned. I said, that is what my father told me when I was 29 and terrified, and had $9,000 left in savings and 0 customers. She said, what did he tell you? I said, that some things could only be learned by standing on the edge of them, that the fear was proof you were in the right place. She said, were you scared when you showed me the document? I said, yes. She said, of what? I said, of what you would do when you saw the full picture, of whether you would walk through the door or walk away from it. She said, I almost walked away. I said, I know. She said, what stopped me? I said, what stopped you? She said, I asked myself what you had done to earn what you had, and I remembered everything I had watched for 4 years, the storage unit, the late nights, the stress you carried at the family dinners when things were hard even when you did not say it out loud, the calls with Dad about the loan, everything. She said, and I knew the answer to what you had done to earn it, and I knew that what I had done was watch. She said, and watching was not enough. I said, no, watching is not enough. She said, so I walked through the door. I said, yes. She said, and you had the door ready. I said, yes. She said, Laura. I said, yes. She said, thank you for having the door ready. I said, thank you for walking through it. Here is what this story is actually about. My sister said family shares everything equally, and she meant it as a claim. She meant it as a logic that justified the conclusion she had already reached, which was that she was owed half of something she had contributed nothing to. And she was wrong. But she was wrong in the specific way that a lot of people were wrong about what they were owed, not from malice, not from greed in the simplest sense, but from the specific confusion between proximity and participation, between watching something get built and being part of the building. That confusion was not entirely her fault. She had been watching for 4 years. She had been present enough to form a picture, and the picture was real in every way except the one that mattered most, which was the full context of what the picture had cost. The debt was the context she was missing. And the most important thing I could give her was not the partnership she demanded. It was the whole picture. Because you cannot make a real decision without the whole picture, and you cannot build something real if you come to it believing the result belongs to you before you have done the work. I wanted my sister to have a real stake in something real. I just could not give it to her until she understood what real meant. The document did that. The 4 days of waiting for the bank to call did that. The kitchen table conversation where I put the unwind agreement and the job offer in front of her at the same time, that did the rest. And what she has built in the 18 months since, the implementation numbers, the client relationships, the professional identity she has found in work that matches her actual skills, that belongs entirely to her. She earned it. The equity she is building toward is not a gift, and it is not a correction of an injustice, and it is not the result of family sharing everything equally. It is the result of showing up and doing the work and understanding what she agreed to before she agreed to it. That is the whole difference. That is the distance between watching something get built and being part of the building. One of them earns you a seat at the table. The other one earns you a front row view of someone else's seat. My sister chose the table. I am glad she did. Thank you for being here with me through this whole story. It is a long one, and the real parts of it are the parts that are hardest to talk about clearly, which is the dynamic between 2 sisters who love each other and who almost let a misunderstanding about what family means become a permanent damage. It did not become permanent because both of us were willing to have the honest conversation instead of the comfortable one. Like this video right now, if any part of this connected with you. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Every week I have a story that is real and that goes somewhere you are not expecting. I want you to be here for all of them. Share this with someone who is navigating a family and business situation right now. Someone who is trying to figure out where the line is between what you owe your family and what you built yourself. This story might help them think it through. Comment below. Tell me what you think about the document. Was it the right move to let Diane sign without stopping her? Was there a better way? Tell me your honest take. I want to hear all of it. Every comment gets read. Every single one.